Good evening. My name is Katie Batchelder, and I am a freshman from Hillsdale, Michigan. It is my privilege to introduce to you our speaker for this evening. Dr. Burton Folsom Jr. studied at Centre College before receiving his BA from Indiana University. Dr. Folsom holds a master's degree from the University of Nebraska and a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He has taught at Murray State University, Northwood University, and currently holds the Charles Klein Chair in History and Management at Hillsdale College. He also worked for several years at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and the Center for the American Idea. He is currently a guest scholar at the Heritage Foundation, senior historian at the Foundation for Economic Education, and writes a quarterly column for the Freeman. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Business History Review, Investor's Business Daily, and the Washington Times, among others. He has made numerous radio and television appearances, including The Glenn Beck Show, Fox and Friends, and C-SPAN. He has published 6 books, including Myth of the Robber Barons and New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Folsom.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Katie, and thanks to Dr. Kaltoff and my colleagues in the history department. Thank you to Tim Kaspar and Doug Jeffrey for inviting me to this CCA, which is entitled FDR and the New Deal Love Fest. At least that's what it's entitled so far. Actually, I think it's delightful to get different points of view on a subject that is as important as this subject. And I especially admire the civility and the courteous behavior that we always show at Hillsdale College to our guests, whether we agree with the guests and speakers or not. I've learned my lessons actually on civility from FDR himself. Franklin Roosevelt was kind of practiced in the art of civility because he would hold these cabinet meetings or conferences, and often he would be in a situation where people would say, do you like this idea, or do you like this person to be promoted or to hold a particular position? And Roosevelt, he didn't want to be in a position to say, no, this guy's a jerk, because then somebody surely would take it out of that meeting and go tell the guy that that's what Roosevelt said, right? And so, I mean, you don't want anything like that. So he didn't want to make any negative comments that might be taken and re-quoted later. And so Roosevelt had a way when he would be in these kinds of meetings, if anybody would make a suggestion, do you think this person ought to be promoted to this position? If he didn't think so or didn't like him, he would just do this. And that pretty much got the message across, conveyed what he was thinking, and that way he didn't have to have anybody say that he'd said anything. So in that tradition, regarding some of the things that have been said in the New Deal CCA so far, my attitude a little bit is this. But don't quote me on it. It is fun that we can laugh about ideas on something this important. This is one of the most important times in American history. The ideas that come out of the New Deal are absolutely exciting, absolutely important to study. And here at Hillsdale College, we bring in both sides. There are campuses all over America that if they would have a similar event such as this, or any other kind of event, it would be one totally dominated by political correctness. They would not have someone from the other side in. I have occasionally been invited to some of these to be the one person presenting the free market perspective. And I can say this, as I was watching the events as they've taken place today, never have I been treated as well on those campuses all around America as our campus here at Hillsdale treats people who come in here who may not be expressing ideas that the audience would be completely in agreement with. And I like that. When I was speaking, for example, recently at UCLA, a very liberal campus, and the audience, they had a rough look to them. It was one of those audiences. They didn't have suits and ties and all this and name cards and all this. And so I was trying to pump myself up backstage. You can do it, get in there, The person who was organizing the event came up to me and introduced me to Manuel here, this big guy. And he said, Manuel, he's your bodyguard. And he was with me the entire event until the time I left and got in a cab to leave. I had a bodyguard with me speaking on that campus. Now, at Hillsdale College, needless to say, I don't need a bodyguard. Except at the end of the semester when I'm delivering my grades to Central Hall, and then sometimes I might need one. But it's a much more civil atmosphere at Hillsdale College, and for that I appreciate. Getting into this subject of the New Deal and the ideas which we're talking about, I'd like to make 2 points right off. And the first point is, when we talk about the Great Depression, one of the points we need to get straight right off is that the government was heavily responsible for the damage that created the Great Depression. Now, some of that our speakers have already gotten into with the problems with the Federal Reserve, with raising interest rates and the disappearance of a fourth to a third of our money supply was very damaging. Milton Friedman, of course, eventually winning the Nobel Prize, and largely for his work on the Great Depression and the Federal Reserve and the problems that it caused. Also, another problem was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. We had the highest tariff in United States history that was passed in 1930. And this tariff raised prices heavily on over 1,000 items, and we had significant tariffs on over 3,200 items. And the problem that creates is this. If we're going to charge, say if Swiss watches are going to be $4, and if we're going to tell the Swiss, because that's their major export, we won't buy your watches except we'll pay you the $4, and then we'll put a $4 tariff on those watches, so they'll cost $8 over here, then we're not buying as many. And so we just close off our export-import market, and then Switzerland in turn enacts retaliatory tariffs, and they refuse to buy our products. And if you look at the auto industry, for example, we were selling 5 million cars, mostly out of Detroit here in Michigan, in 1929, and that was down to 1.5 million. In 1933. Now, there were a variety of things involved with that, but the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was a critical factor in that. So the tariff is a factor in causing the Great Depression, and also Herbert Hoover then proceeded to enact, with Congress's cooperation, of course, the highest peacetime set of taxes, income tax rates, excise taxes in U.S. history. And so that is going to make it so investors are not going to have incentives to invest. They're going to have incentives to retreat from investment, to put their money into tax-exempt bonds, foreign investments, this sort of thing. And we see the economy contracting, and we do indeed see the rate that has been mentioned by some of our speakers of 25% unemployment, which we had in 1932 and 1933. So my first point is that government was heavily involved in the causing of the Great Depression. That's the first point right off. And our second point that needs to be made is that if we're going to talk about the New Deal, and we're going to look at, was the New Deal successful to some extent? And our main measurement is going to be unemployment. To the extent that we're resolving the unemployment problem, then we have to say the New Deal was a failure. The New Deal was a failure. Up until the time of the Great Depression, we had never in our history had unemployment higher than 17%. That was the worst rate we'd ever had in U.S. history. Toward the end of Roosevelt's second term, he could no longer really blame Hoover at that point. In 1939, toward the end of his second term, unemployment in April was 20.7%, roughly 21%. 4 points higher 10 years after the Great Depression had started, and into Roosevelt's seventh year in the White House. 4 points higher than it had ever been in the history of the United States. And this was an absolute disaster. I begin my book, New Deal or Raw Deal, with this quotation from his Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, who's just pulling his hair. Morgenthau is a great friend of Roosevelt. The two of them, they'd been friends for decades. Roosevelt put Morgenthau into the Treasury Department because he wanted a friend there. And Morgenthau had been active in the political campaigns of Franklin Roosevelt. Their two wives were both named Eleanor. And Morgenthau and Roosevelt, they'd sometimes pass notes back to one another during cabinet meetings. They would have lunch regularly together. Eleanor one time said Henry Morgenthau was one of the two people who could tell Franklin Roosevelt to his face he was wrong and get away with it. Henry Morgenthau is saying this right after the unemployment statistics come in at almost 21% in 1939. He says, and this is a commentary on the New Deal, we have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. And I have just one interest, and if I am wrong, somebody else can have my job. I want to see this country prosperous. I want to see people get a job. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started and an enormous debt to boot. Which is true, we had doubled the national debt in Roosevelt's years in office at that point, into his seventh year. And what I'm saying is this, we have 21% unemployment, 4 points higher than it had ever been in United States history before the Great Depression. And we had doubled the national debt. And that's our recovery program. Measured by unemployment and getting out of the Great Depression, the New Deal was a colossal failure. Now, it suggests government solutions do not work well. It suggests that the ideas of John Maynard Keynes do not work well. He had written his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. He'd even had an interview with Franklin Roosevelt. And he came to the conclusion that we needed to spend lots of money on public works. They called it aggregate demand management, that you would increase the amount of government spending. Of course, you have to tax people often to get those dollars or go into debt. And then you'd spend that, and you'd have a multiplier effect, and then you would be able to get out of a depression or a recession through that. Now, I say this is what Keynes seems to be saying, because if you read Keynes, you quickly learn that there's Keynesian English and there's English. I'm trying to summarize Keynes. Let me quote him on unemployment. Quote, men are, and this is from his book, men are involuntarily unemployed if, in the event of a small rise in the price of wage goods relative to the money wage, both the aggregate supply of labor willing to work for the current money wage and the aggregate demand for it at that wage would be greater than the existing volume of unemployment. Well, there you have it. You got it. Hey. The interpretation that was given to his writings was that we needed to invest, and we needed to invest heavily, public works, this sort of thing. Keynes himself said, boy, if we pulled all the houses down in South London and then rebuilt them, that'd put lots of people to work. Well, let's look at how we applied some of these ideas. They were in the air. Keynes wasn't the only one who had them. This was part of the progressive impulse of the early 1900s as it had evolved by the 1930s. And let's look at some of these programs. We've been reluctant to discuss some of them in a little bit of detail. We have the AAA for farmers, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Well, that's an interesting law. What we're going to do here, because we have an overproduction of farm products and farmers have low wages. So the ideas that we come up with, and this is a battle of ideas, is the idea is that we pay farmers not to produce. Now, if we pay farmers not to produce and take part of their land out of circulation in return, then the supply will be lower because we're taking land out of circulation, and the farmers will have more money because we're paying them not to produce. We also have a parity system to help raise the price of their crops, but the fundamental idea, we'll pay them not to produce, and then that will help alleviate the farm crisis. I'm sorry to have to say this. Only an academic could come up with an idea like that. Professor John D. Black, economist at Harvard, that was his brainchild, and there were others involved too. And it just was such a wonderful idea. We'll pay people not to produce. And it's interesting to look, because this is, again, the progressive impulse, the optimism that we can solve the problems of humankind. And here's how you first of all have a deal. Okay, we're going to let them take a quarter of their land out of circulation. We'll pay them roughly $10 an acre, which would be $100 an acre or so today, for each acre of land they take out of circulation, and then we won't have as much overproduction. Well, the first thing we find out is that farmers, once you tell them to do that and they agree to do it, some of them do it and some don't. I mean, they all take the money. They all agree to that. It's just some really maybe don't take their land out of circulation. So we have to send inspectors with measuring equipment to go by and measure all of their land to make sure they're really taking a fourth of it out of circulation. And then we discover, I hate to say this to the ears of Hillsdale students, some of the farmers bribed the inspectors. And you weren't going to fool our ag department, and so we had to send inspectors by to inspect the inspectors. We figured the cost of double bribing would be too high, and therefore it would make them honest. You know, this is my first year when I got out of graduate school. I was a new professor. I was teaching at a regional campus in Kentucky, and there were a lot of old Southern gentlemen on the faculty. It was my first year, and I wanted to get in good with them because I was hoping to get tenure, and I'm not a Southerner, and I was wanting to get in good with them. And one of the chairman of the tenure committee was going to go to a conference, and I was asked if I'd like to just come along, and I thought, hey, this is a real opportunity. You know, and I came along, and I thought maybe I didn't even know if he knew my name. You know, at least I can get to know him maybe. And so we were talking, and he was asking me what I had done in my life, and I asked him what he had done in his life. And he was going, well, when I was in college, I worked as an inspector for the AAA. And I just blurted out, did you take any bribes? He may have thought I was really anxious for tenure, I think. That may have been what I was trying to find out. But, you know, I just blurted it out, and it was funny. He says, no, the best offer I had was a new set of tires. And then he got really mad because he says, I had a friend, and he got all the good bribes. Well, we go through the inspectors who are coming on the land here, and that doesn't work real well. So then we have the bright idea to do aerial photography. So we're going to do aerial photography of all of this land to make sure they've taken the land out of circulation. So now look at this. We've got inspectors inspecting the inspectors' aerial photographs to make sure we take all of this land out of circulation. We take it out of circulation, and sure enough, in 1935, 2 years later, we have crop shortages. The United States has to import 34 million bushels of corn in 1935. And of course, we had our own global warming back then in the Midwest, and then the cooling and then warming. And so we didn't have good crops in the Midwest, and 34 million bushels of corn we had to import, 13 million bushels of wheat. But it was even in the South this was going on. We imported 36 million pounds of cotton. What I'm telling you is we're going on into the South, onto cotton plantations, paying the people on those plantations not to produce, and then turning around and paying for imports, high-priced imports from foreigners to make up the difference. And that's our farm policy. We could go on to the National Recovery Act, the NRA. I don't want to talk too much about that. I thought Professor Brinkley was right. It was a disaster. We got businessmen together and said, why don't you set the prices you want to charge for your products, you think you ought to charge, and then we'll make those prices legally binding. And just to make sure, anybody who sells below that, we'll send them to jail. And so, there's a section of my book dealing with these people who went to jail. And it's really a very sad, for giving discounts to customers. One of them, Jacob Magid, was a tailor. And the NRA code for pressing a pair of pants was 40 cents. And his shop was off of Main Street in Jersey City, New Jersey. So see, he couldn't get people to come to his shop if he charged what everybody else was charging, the 40-cent rate. So he was giving discounts at 35 cents to press a pair of pants so that they'd walk a few blocks to get to his shop. Well, the NRA closed him down, sent him to jail, and we got a variety of comments on this. He's in jail, and he says, you can't tell me how to run my business. Well, they did tell him how to run it, and they put him in jail. I like this, though. The Washington Post said this. It didn't matter, the Washington Post said, if Magid had to charge less than the bright, shiny tailor shop up the street. If he wanted to continue to exist, the law said he couldn't. Now, I like this. For a parallel, the New York Herald Tribune said, for a parallel, it is necessary to go to the fascist or communist states of Europe. And we finally had the Supreme Court strike down the NRA, National Recovery Act, in 1935, and it's going to be off the books. But that was the plan for business. And we have those NRA papers in the Library of Congress. And someday, Hillsdale, we are represented, as you know now, in Washington, D.C. I think it would be fun to have some students do some papers right out of those original archives and see what else can be found on the National Recovery Act. Well, let's look at the Pump Priming Act, the WPA. That one was Works Progress Administration. You build roads, you build bridges, you build airports, you build schools. It sounds good in theory, doesn't it? You have unemployed people, and you put them to work building those roads and schools, a lot of roads. And you have that then that will reduce unemployment, is the idea. But what we have to realize is $4.8 billion, which doesn't seem like a lot now when trillion is the only word that seems meaningful, but $4.8 billion was the largest investment in a domestic program that we had ever had in the United States before like this. It was $4,800,000,000. And so what this does is it gives Roosevelt this humongous pile of cash, and he ends up, because he has tremendous control over it, divvying it up into areas that he wants to capture the votes in that are politically expedient, who have congressmen or senators in those districts who will do what he says. And so this makes it an incredible program to subsidize much of the New Deal. I have some quotations. Just gives you a flavor here of how a lot of Democrats were looking at the WPA. V.G. Copeland, the Democratic County Chairman of Indiana, said this, quote, "What I think will help is to change the WPA management from top to bottom. Put men in there who are in favor of using these democratic projects to make votes for the Democratic Party." That is the heart of a lot of the New Deal. James Doherty, a New Hampshire Democrat, agreed, quote, "It is my personal belief that to the victor belongs the spoils, and that Democrats should be holding most of those WPA positions so that we might strengthen our fences for the 1940 election." I like one WPA director in New Jersey. I have in my book, "A Corrupt but Candid Man." Answered his telephone, quote, "Democratic headquarters." So you have the chairman of the WPA answering his phone, Democratic headquarters. They have a file in the National Archives on WPA/political corruption, and it's huge, and it's by state. And if you look at that, you find things like this. Frank Towie of New Jersey announced at a Democratic rally in Newark, New Jersey, quote, "In this county, there are 18,000 people on the WPA. With an average of 3 people in a family, you have 54,000 potential Democratic votes. Can anyone beat that if it is properly mobilized?" Do you see here how Franklin Roosevelt is winning elections? See, one of the problems in analyzing the New Deal is the programs didn't work, but the fallback position of Roosevelt's defenders often is, well, yes, but he must have given people hope and change. And we know that because he was winning elections and winning them big. See? In other words, he would have his fireside chats and people would listen and he would give them hope. And look at these jobs and these people working on these jobs. So he was trying, he was doing his best, and you have to therefore give him credit for that. But what you have to see is that this money, which you can understand why the founders were so specific in Article 1, Section 8, not letting all of these programs be part of the federal government. To federalize all this is to put into the hands of a president a huge political war chest. It's interesting to listen to these are Democrats who voted for Roosevelt. These are his friends who are saying this. I don't quote his enemies because at Hillsdale College, we believe in G and PG lectures. And so I'm quoting his friends. And here's what his friends say. The Democratic senator from Virginia, Carter Glass, says this: "The 1936 elections would have been much closer had my party not had a $4.8 billion relief bill as campaign fodder." In other words, you target congressional districts. You target key states. Pennsylvania was a swing state, very important. The Democrats had not carried it in decades and decades. Roosevelt wanted it. Lots of WPA money into Pennsylvania. You target the key states. You tell the people running as Democrats to mention all the programs that are coming into the states, and then you say, if you would like this to continue, vote for Roosevelt and vote the Democratic ticket. And as one Republican said after the election, apparently you can't beat Santa Claus. And that's what happened in the 1936 election. A tremendous victory for Roosevelt. And I don't mean it was just the WPA. See, there are a whole lot of programs that just sometimes get missed in the textbook. For example, how many have heard of the Silver Purchase Act? You know, we were busily purchasing silver. It was a subsidy to 6 Western states to get their votes, which Roosevelt did. What you do is the normal price of silver, which is a main industry in those Western states, it was roughly, the market price was about 40 cents an ounce. The Silver Purchase Act, which Roosevelt signed, would pay silver miners 64.5 cents an ounce. See, in other words, it would pay them almost 50% more than the market value of silver. And so the law of unintended consequences comes in, and there's this huge outpouring of silver in the West. In fact, it wasn't just in the West. We had people in Mexico smuggling silver across the border. Because you buy it at 40 and you can sell it at 64.5, so we had issues of silver imports coming in. And according to the rules of the Silver Purchase Act, you couldn't get rid of it. I mean, sure, you were making some silver for industrial uses, but this had to be stockpiled. After 8 years of stockpiling silver, we had 42,000 tons of silver, according to that act the federal government had. I mean, I just don't know what kind of shape this is in. I mean, it's almost like the Tower of Babel, going up there where God says, don't do this, as it goes up, up, up. Let me try. Everybody, close your eyes for a minute. Everybody, close your eyes. Amelia, make sure, wrap their knuckles if they're not closing. Don't fall asleep on me, promise. Close your. Try to imagine a mountain of 42,000 tons of silver. Imagine what it looks like, 42,000 tons. Okay. I had you do that because so much of the defenders of Roosevelt approach the problem this way. They say, think of it this way. Lots of people having jobs, and they're working on the jobs, and he's trying to get us out of the Great Depression. Well, one way to get around this is to say, yeah, look at the tax dollars going out of a lot of people's wallets into those jobs, which are doing things like piling 42,000 tons of silver into a big pile. I hope someone here, when you write your essays on the CCA, draw the most imaginative diagram of 42,000 tons of silver. Listen, I'll give a copy of my book to the most imaginative drawing of 42,000 tons of silver, how that looks like and how that was done. What you have to have a vision here is money, see dollars going out of the wallets of everybody all over the country, flowing over there into the western states, and then see in Washington a mountain of 42,000 tons of silver, which constitutes 2%, almost 2% of the entire national debt. Almost 2% of our entire national debt in a big mountain of silver, which we're not allowed to get rid of. And this is what was supposed to get us out of the Great Depression. It didn't do it. There's no silver lining in that cloud. Some of this is tragic because in World War II, we finally got to spend the silver. Because, we had to for industry. And then Roosevelt was worried he wouldn't be able to carry those western states. And some of this is very tragic because that's when we began rounding up the Japanese. 110,000 Japanese. Once you begin to centralize power and increase it in the state, then we get the rounding up of Japanese, which is very popular with a lot of the same people who are now mad because you're using up their silver. Now they're happy because they've got the Japanese out of circulation. It's sad to read. Eric Muller, in his recent book, American Inquisition, documents how Roosevelt knew in 1942, 1943 that those Japanese were loyal, that many of them were fighting overseas in a very loyal way to the United States, but he would not let them out because he said if they come out in the 1944 election, which I plan to run for a fourth term, what will happen is they'll be mad at us in those western states. And that becomes a reason. You have to see the politics of all of this. The politics of federal programs, centralizing power, the use of those programs to, in effect, bribe or buy votes, then win re-election and change American politics forever because the other side, poor Alf Landon running against Roosevelt said, oh, this AAA is terrible. And then Roosevelt said, well, what are you going to do? And, a lot of farmers said, you're going to take our subsidy away? Well, no, I won't take your subsidy away. He said, I'll manage it better. So what you get a choice in 36 is, do you vote for the guy who gave you your subsidy or the guy who alleges that he will manage it better? And that's been part of the dilemma of the Republican Party ever since, how to respond to that. This has to be paid for with taxes. You almost never see a New Deal book that discusses taxes. It has to be discussed. If you're going to discuss the programs and you're going to talk about those, and some were better than others, and some were worse than others, then you've got to talk about how we're going to spend for those programs. And we need to make a statement right off that we had very high taxes on the wealthy people. Roosevelt raised the top rate on the federal income tax to 79% in 1935. In other words, we're asking investors, this is a marginal rate, the top rate, to give up 4/5 of all their income past a certain level to invest in companies. And then we find, lo and behold, they don't do it. And Roosevelt is angry, and he builds his 1936 campaign against these people. And he said, they hate me, and I welcome their hatred. That's what Roosevelt said during the campaign. And in 1937, we hear talk, well, Roosevelt cut spending, and that was no good. First of all, we need to make a point. It's true. After the 36 election into 37, we slightly cut spending. It was not big, and we still were running a big deficit. Why did we cut spending slightly? Because we always cut spending slightly after an election. Roosevelt had just been reelected. So the WPA dropped in numbers because we don't need those people anymore. So we did have sort of a drop in spending. But what we also have that is not often mentioned is we had an undistributed profits tax, a special tax on corporations. We had Roosevelt with encouraging, to some extent, mandatory collective bargaining, which is going to take place, and we're going to get the unionization of the auto companies and others, and we're going to get a minimum wage law that's passed, which is with us today, and that minimum wage law is going to prevent employers from hiring people who cannot add enough value that the minimum wage demands to hire them in their company, and that's going to contribute to unemployment. And then FDR turns the IRS loose against people, Andrew Mellon, he turned it loose against Moses Annenberg. Moses Annenberg edited the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Philadelphia Inquirer ran editorials condemning Roosevelt. So Annenberg discovers, whoa, the IRS investigation is there. He owes money. He goes to prison. And then we find the editor of the Philadelphia Record, which was a Democratic paper, they're getting a loan from Roosevelt's, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, for somewhat the same amount as Annenberg was having to pay back in tax liabilities. And so now we have the Democrats getting a subsidy, the Republican being put in prison on an IRS investigation. Roosevelt then said in 1938 and 39 to Morgenthau, we need to go after all of these rich people with an IRS investigation. And Morgenthau said, well, wait a minute here. Why do we do that? And Roosevelt said, and I quote, because it can gain us 10 million votes. We condemn the rich. We blame them for not hiring people. We go over to unemployed people and say it's their fault. And then when they don't hire, we can blame them. Then that justifies starting a public works program from the taxes which we're taking from them so that they can't expand their factories. This is the heart of the New Deal. And it raises a question, and the last one I want to get at, and then we'll open this up for questions, because we've had this issue of what ends the Great Depression. Yeah, what ends the Great Depression? That's a tough one, and I don't want to pretend as though we have absolute answers. There's research still in progress on this. But I would like to say a couple things. You can't very well end a depression. And you could ask Dr. Wolf from here on campus. By building stuff and bombing people and say that that's getting you out of a Great Depression. I really urge you to take Econ 105, and you'll get the full story on that. But let me give you the abridged version. You have here 12 million people we're sending overseas. Now that's good, from an unemployment sense, that's good, because we had a little bit less than that who were unemployed. So we're sending 12 million overseas, and then we have 12 to 15 million people working in the defense industry. So I think you can see, therefore, unemployment goes way down. By the way, which is interesting, because the WPA, for a while, is still going in the midst of this, because Roosevelt still had elections going on here. But in any case, put that aside. We've got 12 million people overseas in the military. We have 12 to 15 in defense industries. That's well and good, but as we've had pointed out by speakers already, the national debt then goes from $40 billion to $260 billion. So see, what we've in effect done is we've taken all those people, subsidized them while they go dropping bombs on places, and now we have a debt of $260 billion. We increased the national debt by sixfold. In other words, we started the war with about $40 billion national debt, then we're up to $260 billion. My goodness, the interest rate on the $260 billion is almost as much as the whole national debt was before that. I mean, not quite. The debt was a little bit higher than that. But, I mean, it gets you thinking, my gosh, this is a huge national debt. So we didn't solve the Great Depression. In fact, the issue is, what are we going to do after the boys come home? And many New Dealers said, oh, we need a New Deal. They called it the New Deal Revival. We're going to get a host of new federal programs to bring them back. They were not successful. In fact, they were distinctly unsuccessful, and you had, and I quote from Congress here, Senator Walter George in October 24th, 1945, talks about a bill to cut tax rates to get us out of the Great Depression. He says, you're right, we're going to get into the Great Depression is going to go on after the war if we continue the New Deal. He says, there are people out there who want to rebuild our stockpile of silver. And so he said, we need tax cuts because that's what we tried in the 1920s when the top rate was 25%, and that is what worked then. Andrew Mellon said in the 1920s, our Secretary of Treasury in the 20s, and I quote, it seems difficult for some to understand that high rates of taxation do not necessarily mean large revenue to the government, and that more revenue may often be obtained by lower rates. In other words, he's saying if you cut the rates, it may, in addition to encouraging investment, it may actually increase revenue. He was right on both counts. Calvin Coolidge had the lowest inflation and unemployment rate of any president of the 20th century. We had budget surpluses every year of the 1920s. We chopped off almost a third of the national debt. And we had senators who remembered that in 1945 and said, let's go back to that and try that because the spending stuff isn't working. Here's what Senator Walter George, another Democrat, who had been enlightened on this issue, and here's what he says. He's talking about this bill to cut tax rates. And I might add, just so I describe this bill specifically, it cut the income tax rate, because after the war, the income tax rate was 94% on top incomes. I always like to say to FDR that 6% was money left on the table, you know. But it was 94% on top incomes, and the corporate rate the top rate was 90%. This bill was going to lower the top income tax rate some, but the big lowering was the corporate rate because we were removing this excess profits tax, and we were cutting it from 90% to 38% as a top rate. That was the proposal. Senator George says this bill is properly a tax rate reducing bill. It will not necessarily reduce the amount of revenue coming in. Indeed, if it has the effect which it is hoped it will have, it will so stimulate the expansion of business as to bring in a greater total revenue. I think if one will look back to World War I, he will understand precisely what I am trying to say. Senator from New Jersey, Albert Hawks, who was a businessman in the Senate, said this: the repeal of the excess profits tax, in my opinion, may raise more revenue for the United States than would be raised if it were retained. Those bills come into effect, and indeed we do, over a period of 3 or 4 years, see a sharp increase in revenue to the government. But more than that, we sent a message to business people: we're cutting your taxes. We want you to invest again in the American economy. And they did in tremendous amounts, and we had only 3.9% unemployment in 1946 and 1947. The tax cuts, I think, played a big role in getting us out of the Great Depression. Now, some people say, well, you've dug this up in congressional records, you know, how can people understand and get at that? Well, the reason I have these quotations is they were given to me by my research assistant here at Hillsdale College, Jim Nesbitt, who went home and over break at Cincinnati, Ohio, went into the University of Cincinnati, dug up this information, brings it in, and now I'm quoting it. I think if Hillsdale students can do it, that my fellow historians can do it too. I regret that the New Deal failed. It was an abysmal failure. It sent us on the wrong direction. But we were able to overcome pieces of it, definitely, and that tax cut going into effect, producing more economic growth, is a remarkable example of that. President Reagan, as you know, President Kennedy, even in the 60s, and then Reagan in the 80s, also cut taxes, and they saw tremendous economic growth and a lowering of unemployment. And I would like to suggest not stimulus packages and not priming the pumps with WPAs, and certainly not the Keynesian argument that we absolutely need to have vast public works, but cutting taxes, and don't let central planners and presidents determine what politically good districts they're going to send the money into. Let business people and American people invest, start up businesses, expand existing ones, put people to work, invent and develop television and those things after the war, and send the American economy on a prosperous route with relative freedom and limited government. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I couldn't have done it without Senator George and Senator Hawks. They're the ones who deserve the ovation. Without them, we would not have good arguments and good answers to this difficult question of dealing with the Great Depression and getting out of it. Why don't we have some questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Folsom. Dr. Folsom will be available after our questions for a book signing in the lobby, and his book, New Deal or Raw Deal, will be available for purchase.
Thank you, Dr. Folsom.
Yes.
I just had one question about the tax cuts you were talking about.
Sure.
What was Roosevelt's opinion on those? Did he support them, or was he against them?
The interesting thing is he was against them and he was in the grave. He always was against. He was always against tax cuts, and he would have opposed them. He never had a tax cut. He never had a tax cut. And his idea was that if you take this money and you centralize it, that he and other central planners and others, politicians, would be able to spend it and help the American economy better than people would be able to spend their own money. In effect, that's his philosophy. And so he was not in favor of tax cuts. He did die before the end of the war, and so he didn't personally get involved, which in many ways was good because Truman was not as good a manipulator as Roosevelt. And I say that to Truman's credit. Truman is a very honest person. He agreed with Roosevelt, but Truman would be right honest with you. You know, he wouldn't come up and say, I like this bill, and if you don't like it, I'm going to have an IRS investigation of you. That wasn't his approach. And so he honestly said, well, I'm just going to oppose this. And then the other senators favored it, and they passed it, and it became law.
Hello. The New Deal horror story my mom brought me up on was the confiscation of the gold. Do you have anything to say about that episode? My grandfather was very disappointed that it didn't start a civil war.
Yeah, I do talk about that in the book. All we can say is Roosevelt did indeed confiscate gold. He had to because he was manipulating the currency and the price of the currency. If he had not confiscated the gold, if he'd inflated the currency and the U.S. had committed to pay a certain price for gold, people would just take the inflated currency and then buy gold. And he couldn't have that. And so he felt he had to take. It's a good example where you try one intervention and it leads you to have to do another intervention. And pretty soon, you are really damaging individual liberty, and I think you see that with the gold confiscation. and the whole U.S. getting off the gold standard. Yes?
Thank you again, Dr. Folsom, for that lecture.
Well, sure.
Well-
Is that Tyler out there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Tyler.
Reminded
Good.
me of your class.
Tyler, you look so good in that beard. I really...
Well, anyway, I don't want to take up people's time with pleasantries. Your speech I greatly enjoyed it. But there was one issue. With the silver, the 42 tons, was it?
42,000 tons.
42,000 tons.
Right.
I had never heard of that before, and I'd be very interested to know where it actually went, and the details behind it.
Well, I mean, you have a point, Tyler. It's not the sort of thing that Morgenthau over in Treasury could say, well, let's just put this in the closet. We had a lot of it apparently at the mints in San Francisco and in Denver and in Philadelphia. And apparently, as I understand it, in Fort Knox we had some too, and we had some in Washington. I'm not sure of the various amounts. It's a question I'm interested in too, because it's hard to hide that quantity of silver. And by the way, I divide Roosevelt's programs into two categories: the bad programs and the worse programs. And I haven't even given you the worst programs tonight. The worst programs have death rates, such as his attempt to say, no, the commercial airlines are making obscene profits with airmail travel, so we'll take it from them and have the Army deliver the mail, and then the Army delivers the mail, and crash, crash, crash. We have 12 pilots killed, and then he says, well, let's go back to having the airlines deliver the mail, the commercial. You know, we had those programs that are in the mix too. Tyler, we don't hear a lot about New Deal programs. I focused on the WPA and the AAA and the NRA. That's the heart of the New Deal, and I feel that's where the battle ought to be fought, rather than going off on these side programs. But I just want you to know, like the Silver Act, it's part of Roosevelt's effort to be reelected. The silver fits with the WPA. They're targeted subsidies to special interests to get the votes to get reelected. Yeah.
Dr. Folsom, thank you very much for your speech. And I'd like to hear something about contextualizing a solution for today. I mean, our tax cut's going to get us out of $20 trillion of debt. Is the rise of, or the problem of North Korea, the rise of Islam, China, the huge trade imbalance, all of these serious problems we're facing today, can they even be compared? Do you have any idea of what would be a good course, even if it may be difficult to accomplish in the coming years? And last question is, what is your web address for your campaign funding?
I'm not campaigning, but I do have a blog at burtfolsom.com. And I try to apply history to current events, often with the New Deal, when I discuss contemporary issues. So I do that at burtfolsom.com. You're welcome to subscribe free. I'm an optimist. You know, your question implied pessimism. And I think historians, oddly enough, in some ways, if they'll think through it, they tend to be optimistic, because every period that we study, if you read the newspapers and contemporary accounts, they always think, oh my gosh, this is a crisis, it's unsurmountable. And you see this especially in the 1930s, studying the New Deal, where people are just, they say, my gosh, it's up, taxes at 90%, look at all the power this guy has, look what he's doing with the silver, what he's doing with the WPA, the civilization is over. And it wasn't. Good ideas had a way of prevailing. They didn't prevail right away, but they did eventually. We tried tax cuts in the 1920s. We had high unemployment after World War I. Harding and Coolidge came in with Mellon, and there were people who wanted a stimulus package then, and they said, no, cut the taxes. They did, and we went from 12% unemployment in 1921 to 2% unemployment 2 years later. It was that quick, and the 20s ended up being a great economic decade. It looked hopeless there in 1921. It wasn't later. The despair I see by many free market thinkers in the 1930s is pitiful. And yet look what happened. We get the tax cuts. Pretty soon we go through the 1980s. We get the rates down to 28%. So, I mean, here they were at 94%, and now the top rate's at 28% in the 1980s. We get that. Then we have a boom, another historical example of giving people more freedom produces more prosperity for them. The lesson proved again. And so I'm satisfied that history, one of the things history helps us with, is that good ideas have a way of coming back and being successful over time. Not right away, but over time. And good ideas that we've had in the past will be applied again, and we have people trying to do that. And therefore, I believe we will see an improvement in the economic situation we have today.
I was curious, why does it seem like so many academias and politicians ignore these facts? And what do you think the best way to communicate these ideas is?
Yes, the first question is one that really is, why do so many academicians go in for the what we might call the liberal argument that we need to spend a lot? I think here, it's careful because I don't want to get in people's heads. It's easier to describe what happened and what the consequences are rather than saying, why are they doing what they're doing? Which it puts you on a little more speculative ground. But I do know this, being around academics, they don't like the idea that in free markets, an underwear salesman can earn more than they do. And the truth is that capital is distributed in such a way that if you can market products that have value, it creates jobs and it creates economic development and wealth for the people who develop them. And the idea that, no, we can plan the economy, turn it over to the experts who are highly trained in economics, and that they will come in and tell us what to do, will produce better, is very compelling and attractive to many academics. And I think that explains a lot of it. What we can do, we do what we can do. One thing that excites me teaching here at Hillsdale College is that we have a lot of people here who really get it. And they're going to go out there, and I'm going to be gone and go off to my great reward, and you guys are still going to be here. And it gives me pleasure to say, hey, I'm helping develop the human capital, as are many of my colleagues in the history department, political science, economics, and other places in the college here, to provide you with the information and the evidence to fight this battle for the next generation. I had to fight it. I'm a baby boomer. I had to fight the battle and the issues that Roosevelt gave us. It's like you go back and you fight the wars the last war. And the last war, when I was growing up, was the FDR war, and you're fighting that one. And lo and behold, it's the same war that we're fighting now. And so these ideas of providing more freedom and individual liberty, freeing up the economy and lowering taxes, and reducing regulations, that will produce and help the economy more than the high tax rate and the centralized government. That idea is alive and well here at Hillsdale College. And I believe that in the next generation, there are people at Hillsdale College that will be fighting that battle and fighting it very effectively. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be here, but I do believe it.
Hi, I'm really curious. It was asserted earlier that in the 30s, the first countries to get out of the Depression were Germany, Britain, because of the rearmament programs. So I'm really curious as to what your opinion is on that.
Well, yes, there are 2 points. First of all, you're back to, okay, you're building for defense. Some of that was. But then you have the question, what do you do when the war is over? So you're back then to, are you going to use freedom or not? Are you going to go with high taxes? The defense industry is only a temporary measure until the war is over. Because otherwise, you get a national debt that rises too high and you go bankrupt. You inflate the currency, it's worthless. So you can't make it completely on defense. That's not going to work. The second thing is, defense didn't become big in most European countries, except for Germany, until the later 1930s. It's interesting, the League of Nations conducted data and collected it on what countries had what rates of unemployment. And it's interesting that when the United States in 1938 had 20% unemployment, which I've been talking, technically was not, at that time it was 19.8, rounded off to 20%, the average that the League of Nations collected for all the other European nations was 11%. Most of that was not through defense. It was in Germany. What I'm telling you is the United States was not only bad, it was disproportionately bad compared to the rest of the world, and that the question that needs to be asked is, why was the U.S. performance distinctively bad against that of the other nations of the world. And that's because our government programs were more disastrous than their government programs. Because we had the undistributed corporate profits tax. We had all those IRS audits. We had a minimum wage law. We had the discussion of Social Security, which is good because we were collecting, as Professor Brinkley said, we're collecting taxes on it all throughout the late 30s, but we're not paying anything out. That takes money out of circulation. We were doing distinctively things bad that other nations weren't doing. Or is there?
Hello, sorry.
Yes, hi.
Hi, my name is Sarah. And I am a student from a school in Southwest Michigan, and I want to just say thank you for your presentation and for all the other
sure.
presentations we've endured so far. It was really wonderful.
Sure.
I would like to ask the question, and that is, I think it's very easy for us to look back 60 years ago and make all these claims of what FDR and the New Deal did wrong, and we have all of this knowledge and this amazing retrospective perspective, but I want to know if the if the conservative politicians of that day were thinking the same things that we're thinking today.
Yeah, good question. Some were and some weren't. There were some who had it figured and many who didn't. But the main thing, the ones who opposed him, who tended to be in the Republican Party, were getting tossed out of office left and right because with these subsidies, see, the Republicans were down to 88 seats in the House. And that means the Democrats had, 360 roughly. And so when you're losing seats at that proportion, a lot of them were having to think, and I understand this, politicians have to be reelected. They can have good ideas, but if they go out of office with those ideas not implemented, their success is not great. Even though they may have advanced an idea, they need to be around to accomplish it. And we just simply didn't have too many people who were opposing Roosevelt who were able to hang on to office. And so that was part of the problem. I do want to say, too, and I want to give Roosevelt some credit. He did reduce the tariff rates from that Smoot-Hawley Tariff with the Reciprocal Tariff Act. Cordell Hull, as Secretary of State, had the authority to do some nation-to-nation reducing, and that helped. So, we did have a couple things here and there that were useful, but by and large, it was not. It was harmful, and it was hard for politicians to oppose it because you start opposing it, and the next thing you know, you're running against a candidate who's just been given huge subsidies to run against you. And he's promising if he's elected, he'll bring projects into that district. And you're sitting there saying, no, we ought to do it privately. And you are in a tough re-election campaign, and this is the dilemma that those who opposed Franklin Roosevelt had then, and it's the dilemma that those who oppose big government have today as well.
Just a reminder that Dr. Folsom will be available for a book signing after questions, and we now have time for one final question.
Thank you, Dr. Folsom. The talk was great.
Thank you.
I won't be able to take your class, but I know my brother will. He's a history major. I had a question for you. I grew up in rural Indiana on a farm, and my grandpa started our farm, but he grew up in the Great Depression. And basically, the way he describes it is, after 1929, the prices of grain and things just fell off the face of the earth, and they were reduced to eating, he basically just ate cabbage and things like that. He still wouldn't touch cabbage. When I knew him, he hated the thing. So my question is for you is, times were bad, and a lot of farmers were losing their farms, and yeah, the AAA might not have been a good solution, but what would be a proactive solution to solve that problem?
Right.
During that time, because people are suffering and they are losing their farms and just losing everything they have, and obviously that isn't good, and a lot of free market people would say that's the flow of the system, but is there a more proactive solution that you would be in favor of?
Yeah, obviously paying farmers not to produce and building a mountain of silver isn't the right one, but nonetheless, you ask a good question. You say, well, what sorts of things can we do? One of the reasons I like the idea of relative freedom is that answers the question in free markets. For example, we have a problem with overproduction of goods and low prices. We have people move off the lands and into the cities. Historically, after all, in our first census, we had over 80% of Americans were farmers. either primarily or at least partly were farmers. And we had that reduced substantially to maybe 25% in the 1930s, and it's down to less than 1%. Today. And so we've been able to pick up those people in the industrial sector. The reason we couldn't do it in the 30s, of course, is because we had such high taxes that we had businessmen, and we had the tariff, and we had the Federal Reserve, those bad solutions, some of which were unique to the 1930s, which is why we didn't have depressions that severe before. And so the secret is, if you can get rid of those, if you can get the tariff down, and I gave Roosevelt some credit, he was working in that direction, but then if you can get the Federal Reserve working in a different way and get the tax rates down, then you free people up. Then you have a bigger demand for farm products because now you can export your farm. See, 25% of American exports our farm products are exported. Well, when we have a Smoot-Hawley Tariff and nobody's buying our farm products, we can't export anymore. You take the tariff down and you get a freer trade system, then they get to export. So I'm saying, when you ask that question, you have to look at it from a standpoint of a lot of things are being done that are bad, and you've got to start taking them off one by one, freeing people up. And I do want to add this. When we had our first welfare system that went into effect, the first relief system in 1932, and it lasted till 33, it was $300 million. We did have Massachusetts, Connecticut, and 6 states that said, we're not going to take this federal aid and get tied into this kind of life. We're going to supply it locally. Even in times of 25% unemployment, you still had states that were able to manage their own relief. And they do it, in the case of Massachusetts, they had exhibition football games between 2 of the colleges there. They had the Boston Symphony playing for charities. They had wealthy people giving food in lines for people. They had teachers. I'm really proud of this. Teachers gave up about 2% of their salary for relief measures to help the people in Massachusetts. The founders wanted people to help people. And more people could have helped more people if we wouldn't have been hampered by so many restrictions in the 1930s.